for the introduction into today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Elena. We can proceed to the next slide when we start to set the stage for the presentation that we will provide you today. So the first question we would like to address is, in a nutshell, why do we need a network code on cybersecurity for the electricity sector? And this question is, we think, well posed, because actually in the last few years we have been witnessing a lot of effort from the legislative authorities in regulating the cybersecurity. Because first we had the Cybersecurity Act, then we had the NIS directive, and in the middle there was also the GDPR, so a regulation for privacy. And then we all know that it's work in progress for the NIS 2.0. That is actually very important directive that will take place of a NIS. And this is all very important regulations. So every one of us is keen to make the better of it. But actually, the electricity sector in itself is not a standard, and that's why general regulation are effective, but a specific regulation can be more effective than a general one. And why is this? This is essentially because here we would like to highlight three main characteristics of electricity sector. The first one is to have real-time requirements. And this is when you're managing a grid, actually you have to keep the grid in balance. This is a characteristic that is not common in other industries. If we think about the banking sector, for example, yes, you have real-time transaction, but a delay in the transaction is something that can be suffered by users, but is not a disaster. While in electricity sector, not respecting the real-time requirement can really cause a cascading effect. And here we go to the second box, and a cascading effect that can really jeopardize the grid, and in the worst case scenario, even cause a blackout. So this is something that we have to take in mind while having this kind of discussion today. And also, this is another characteristic of electricity sector, is that actually the technology mix that you are witnessing in the IT and OT, so information technology as operational technologies that are supporting the electricity sector, are actually a technology mix of legacy systems, so systems that are from the past, that are inherited by not so recent years, and then we have new technologies that are adding information. And so this is a very peculiar situation that must be addressed. And this is on the side of the sector itself. And then we have a global scenario of cyber threats that is actually getting worse. It's in the press more every month at least there is a news of a cyber attack. And if we concentrate on the electricity sector, so on cyber attacks that are targeting the electricity sector, we actually have a smaller sample, but a very significant one. And this is something that, of course, must be taken into account. And the last but not least aspect that we would like to highlight is that energy transition and digitalization are two very important aspects that actually are promising and will provide a better and more efficient use of the grid. But actually what we are doing with the digitalization, that is, of course, an enabler for the energy transition, essentially we are inserting digital layer in something that wasn't engineered in the first place to be digitalized. And this is very useful on one side, because actually you can be more efficient in the management of the grid. But on the other side, you are enlarging what in cybersecurity we call the attack surface. So essentially you have adding digital layers between the business layers that are managing the grid and the devices that are used to manage the grid. So you're actually inserting digital layers, and these digital layers can be attacked. And as the phenomena will progress in time, more and more enlargement of the attack surface can be forecasted. And this is why we need something, a general framework of cybersecurity to actually manage this kind of increasing cyber risk. So Alina, please, can we go to the next slide? Yes. And here you can see in the title, I have highlighted a few, the final part of the title, Network Code for Cybersecurity Aspect of Cross-Border Electricity Flows. This is something also that I would like all of you take in mind while attending today at the workshop, but also reviewing the legal text of the network code. Actually, the network code is very focused on the aspect on cross-border electricity flows. This is very important because the worst scenario at union level and regional level, you will follow this kind of reasoning during the workshop today, later with other presentations. And at union level and regional level, the accent is really on cross-border electricity flows. So all the risks and all the analysis and management practices that will be proposed in the network code are aiming to the better protection of cross-border electricity flows. So the development of the network code, of course, is done under the internal market regulation, so the 2019-943 regulation. And essentially the network code will contain legally binding rules. So essentially every entity within the scope will be requested to comply to this set of rules. So this is very, very important because if we see the electricity sector as a whole, as a chain, of course, the security, the cybersecurity of the whole sector is dependent on the weakest link of this chain. And so it's not enough that just the entities that physically manage the grid. And so today we are the drafting team is an expression of TSOs and DSOs overall, because actually we are the leading parties in drafting of the network code. But we believe, and we are actually drafting the network code itself, encompassing all the entities that are within the scope of the electricity grid and in the electricity sector, because we need to have a broader protection of the sector itself. And another characteristic of a network code is that actually does not duplicate a national regulation, but have to be consistent. National regulation have to be consistent with network code. And so it's in everyone's interest creating a fit for purpose and a network code that is adaptable and adoptable by all member states. And in this regard, of course, stakeholder engagement is crucial. And today's session and the next session that we will plan near the end of the public consultation period are very important moments to share views, to share feedbacks, and of course to have a better consensus over the current draft. We can go to the next slide. Thank you very much. This is a timeline for those of you who have already followed other workshops or other occasion of a discussion like today. Probably is a well-known picture. Here we are depicting the overall process of drafting of the network code. It's actually on impulse of European Commission. It has been approached already in 2019 when European Commission started an informal drafting process. This is when essentially European Commission asked ENTSO-E and DSO associations to start drafting reports that started to draft the contents for the network code. And then in 2021, we had a formal drafting process, the start of a formal drafting process. And key milestones in 2021 were the publication by Acer of the framework guidelines. Framework guidelines are a non-binding document from Acer that draft main contents and main aims of the network code. So in this case, it was an input for the drafting team. And then we had, of course, the formal process, the starting of the formal process that was activated by European Commission, just as I said. Now, in this moment, we are in the official drafting phase that is highlighted in yellow in the bottom of the slide. And the official drafting started in end of July, 27th of July. And we are aiming to finalize the draft of the network code by the 14th of January. And the math is simple, is a very short time. Is a very short time that is that has been requested to us to draft, but is a time that is a time lapse that was requested by the European Commission because of the following phases that you see also sketched in this timeline. On the next after 14th of January, we will have a review from Acer of the legal draft, and this will take some time until following two phases in 2022, impact assessment and procedure to adopt the legal act, the delegated act from European Commission. And after that, the final aim for 2023, the very beginning, is the entry into force of the network code. And after that, as will be evident in the following speech, we will have a transition period of 18 months. It will be dedicated to set up all the tools and all the working groups and mechanics to start to operate the risk management practices described in network code. And so we can expect to have a full enforcement of the network code after 18 months from the entry into force. So this is the general plan. And now with the next slide, we have a specific timeline. You know, is something that actually is focused to give us the progression until the 14th of January. That is, of course, the main milestone for the development team. Today we have already completed the first version of the network code. You have all access of the drafts that have been published on the ENTSO-E site and are proposed to you by ENTSO-E and the UDSO entity, of course. And now we are in the middle of the public consultation phase. Already we received some feedbacks on the platform for the public consultation. So our advice is, of course, to give all the feedbacks today and be taken care of course, just like Alina said, and but of course also to access to the public consultation platform and give a feedback also there. And so public consultation will be with a workshop today, and the next workshop is already planned for the 8th of December of 2021. Following that, we will have a phase 3 with the incorporation of all the comments received and elaboration of all the comments received in order to submit a final draft back to Acer by the 14th of January 2022. So this is essentially what I wanted to tell you to introduce the argument for today. Then I would like to give the floor to Christian to Sabine for a legal framework update. Sabine, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. So this is just more setting the frame. So just for the background, I'm Sabine Hinz. I'm here. I'm for ENTSO-E, but I work for the German TSO 50 Hertz. So just to set the scene on this. So setting the frame, which means the legal framework. So there are already several network codes in place. So maybe for some, this is already known to you. For others, this might be new. But it will be a binding legislation, as Andrea already explained. But there are some things which are quite new to this network code compared to other ones, which means it's the first one that is drafted under the Clean Energy Package rules. That are the rules that were adopted in 2019, revising already existing rules. And it means we are co-drafting the EUDSO entity and ENTSO-E. So there are more drafters around the table, and even more because we set up a drafting committee. Where we explain later on how does it work. It's also a legal obligation to do this, and Furthermore, and the network code is not only covering responsibilities mainly of TSOs and DSOs, but there are many others involved. So Andrea said also mainly the electricity undertakings, but also institutional layers are a bit different because it's a two-sector network code. So it's the cybersecurity sector and it's the electricity sector. You can say it like this. So there is not only the electricity institutions, bodies, and entities involved, but also the same from the cybersecurity side, which means it's not only on European level ASA and ENISA and ENTSO-E and ENTSO entity and the NEMOs. The same for national level, the regulatory authorities, and then the national competent authorities for cybersecurity, risk preparedness, and of course the CSIRTs. There is also a regional level introduced in the network code, as you might have already known or seen in the code text that is on our website, which gives a role to the RCCs, so the regional cooperation centers that are operational as of July 2022. And this is a whole institutional, let's say, salad bowl we try to address in the network code so that each one finds its place and responsibilities. So there are many stakeholders and institutional stakeholders involved. One big challenge is that this code has been drafted, or what you have seen is drafted while current cyber legislation is under revision. We think particularly of the NIS 2 directive, so which is a very milestone in the cybersecurity legislation at European level. So the revision is going on, and at the same time we have to write this network code. So from the adopting procedures at European level, it's most likely that the network code will enter into force before NIS is finalized, because it's a different procedure. So this is a challenge we have to tackle, because we have to avoid that there are overlapping issues and that there may be contradictions between the directive and the network code, which is quite a challenge. Next slide, please, Alina. So the general provisions, so setting the scene for the network code, are described in Title 1 of the legal text of the network code. So you have the legal text and the supporting document. You might have seen it. It's uploaded for public consultation. So we consult the legal text, and the supporting document is there to help you understand the legal text, because it's not an easy read, let's call it like this. So this is a general chapter which exists in most of the network codes, or in all network codes that are in force until now. So there is a scope which is set, so to whom the network code applies, to whom the network code does not apply, what is its territorial scope, so how to deal with third countries, how to deal with, for example, critical service providers that are not based in the European Union but deliver services to undertakings in the European Union. There are provisions with regard to approval, amendment, and consultation procedures. So who has to be consulted on whom before a deliverable is considered final and will in the end be approved by an authority, and becomes binding on the ones who are in the scope of the network code provisions. So we choose, as in other network codes, it's the same approach. We have the methodology approach, which means it's like a stepwise approach. So someone develops the methodologies, in our case, ENTSO-E and the ESO entity, they consult. There is an approval procedure in the end, and then there are different steps until the code becomes binding. And not the code or the deliverable, the methodologies that are to develop, because the code in the end will anyway be binding. Sorry for that. There is a broad stakeholder involvement foreseen. Maybe you have seen it already, because it's planned, or the proposal in the network code is to set up a working group with the stakeholders that accompanies ENTSO-E and the ESO entity to develop all these methodologies and deliverables that are listed in the network code. And last but not least, the regulatory oversight. So who controls the applicability, who is responsible for which layer, so European, regional, and national, and which institution has to cooperate with which institution. This is the main question, I would say, in this number 3. And there are some general clauses, so standard clauses included in the network code about monitoring. So who monitors how the network code is implemented, who collects the data, who provides the data, and how is the implementation assessed. Another proposal in the ASA framework guideline was also to have a benchmarking on the investments in cybersecurity measures. So to assess how many money is spent on increasing cybersecurity in the electricity sector. And there are different methodologies and approaches and let's say key performance indicators that are still to be defined. But the proposal is to see how this could be assessed in a useful way so that we can use the output. In both monitoring and benchmarking, more actors are involved, as I already mentioned, so the RCC, CENISA, and the Cybersecurity National Competent Authorities. Alina, there was a comment just on if you can put it in the PowerPoint mode. I don't know if it's feasible for you. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Sabine. I've seen, and maybe just to excuse myself, but I have tried this option, and with the current setup of the PC that I have, it will be very hard for me to monitor the questions, raise hands, and other elements in the Teams. So I do apologize for keeping the slides like this, but it's just I need to control the other side with the participants as well. And yes, there was another question which I take the opportunity to answer now. We will share the slides with you after the workshop. Thank you.
So thanks, Alina, for clarifying. And just one slide back, it's on the questions. So we also, as you have seen, there is a questionnaire on the website with several questions also on these general provisions. So I put 4 of them in the box, in the right box in blue. So whether you consider the objectives clear, whether the timing is reasonable and feasible to implement the provisions, because it will all entities who are in the scope of the network code that have to comply with its rules and provisions. And also to see, have your feeling about the requirements for the small and micro undertakings for the basic cyber hygiene requirements, which we explain later on in the presentation. And in the end, to have your feeling about monitoring and benchmarking. So we would be grateful to have your feedback on those questions once we are done with the presentation and also in the public consultation. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you, Sabine, for the nice overview on the legal aspects in the general chapter. I'd like to give you a short overview on the structure in which we're working and the organizational structure we're working in. Can you move one slide, please? So maybe you can first focus on the development team. This is the team that Andrea and I are working in and trying to deliver the network code. So as already mentioned, this is the first time ever that a development team consisting equally of UDSO members and ENTSO-E members is working on that to deliver. So first time, it's a premiere. And we started working in this team already in the phase that Andrea mentioned, in the informal phase, ending the work with the final interim report, and then started the formal process in the development team, also with the same members this year in July. So we are staffed equally, as already mentioned. And at the moment, we are on this public consultation path. And how did we work in this team? Because as already mentioned, we are trying to focus on very different topics also in the network code. You might already have seen that when you've read the network code or the explanatory notes. So we splitted our subgroup, our development team in different subgroups that are all focusing on different chapters of the network code. So this was the best way of working for us. We worked in several with several experts in smaller groups, so that we were able to deliver in such a short time. A document which is pretty mature with a good input from all the experts. We are also using, like Sabine already mentioned, based on Article 59 of the regulation, a drafting committee. The drafting committee for us is a kind of advisory committee, and it consists of the main stakeholders that we have. This is in our case Acer, ENTSO-E, and EU DSO entity, as well as some NEMOs. And we are reporting all the steps we're taking from the development team into this drafting committee. For the first time ever, this drafting committee is also co-chaired by EU DSO entity and ENTSO-E, so first time ever here as well. Can you switch one slide, please? As I already mentioned, we organized ourselves in subgroups, and to give you an overview, Sabine already introduced the general chapter. This was done by a separate subgroup, which was focusing on the chapters like already mentioned. We also had a subgroup for cross-border risk management, which has the focus of designing the cross-border risk management process and the identification of the cyber risk, and try to initialize a method there. We have had another subgroup for certification and verification. They were responsible also for the risk management on entity level. And for some other steps we got by the ESA framework guideline, like the Common Electricity Cybersecurity Framework. Also the Cybersecurity Hygiene requirements that have been also already mentioned, and the minimum advanced cybersecurity requirements, where we also get some more insights in the next presentations from my colleagues. Then we had another subgroup for sharing of technical information. They focused on information collection in case of incidents, and they also focused on trainings and cybersecurity exercises that were also briefed by the ESA framework guidelines. So this was our third team. And last but not least, we also had a subgroup for product certification. And as the name already says, the product certification group was mainly focusing on controls for the procurement process and for harmonized security requirements and verification methods for the product certification and the procurement of new products. So this was basically the way we worked in. And I think now we switch into the subgroups and get some more insights on what the subgroups worked on, and give you some overview about the processes we figured out with the help of those subgroups.
Okay, so thank you, Christiane. So so I'll start with the sort of technical subgroup work, starting to give you an overview of the risk-based approach and the scope. So my name is Maarten Hoeve. I'm from ENTSO-E, and I was leading the subgroup on product certification, but also working on sort of the integration of different subgroups. And this is what I will talk about first. So it's very important to keep in mind that the network code is following a risk-based approach. So practically that means that both the scope of the network code and the measures that entities need to take are determined by a risk assessment. And this risk assessment is repeated every 2 years. And this risk-based approach has a big advantage in that we can respond to new threats or developments in the smart grid. And as Andrea explained, both the threat landscape and the smart grid itself are evolving very quickly. So we think this is a very crucial advantage, and it's very important to be able to change the scope and the measures based on these developments. But also as a downside, and the downside is basically that we're adding complexity and uncertainty. So complexity in that we have to set up a risk assessment process at European level, and uncertainty in that we don't know in advance what the exact scope of the network code will be, what the exact measures will be, so that we don't know, for instance, exactly which entities will have to apply which measures. And our challenge, I think, as drafting team, and also where we need your help, is trying to limit these downsides to make it as clear as possible and to make it as simple as possible. So the scope of network code is determined by a top-down risk assessment process, which you see on the left-hand side of this diagram. So it starts with a union-wide risk assessment that's performed by ENTSO-E and the EU-DSO entity supported by the working group where all stakeholders will be represented. And the goal of this union-wide risk assessment is basically to analyze the different processes at the European level that are needed to keep the grid in sort of a good state, and to determine the impact if something would go wrong with these processes, or if there would be a cyber attack on these processes. This union-wide risk assessment would result in three things. So the first is a list of high and critical impact processes. So the processes that are really critical for the European electricity grid, which is one of the inputs for determining scope. The second input is the so-called ECAI, European Cybersecurity Impact Indices, which are sort of measures to determine how the impact if a process is compromised. So they give a measure for an entity to determine if a process would be compromised, if the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the data used in the process is compromised, what would be the impact on the grid. And these ECI are measured, and there would also be two thresholds, one for high impact, one for critical impact. And together, these lists of processes and these ECI and thresholds are used then to determine the scope of the network code. And the final outcome is a risk impact matrix, which is sort of a harmonized way to measure the risk of electricity grids, which is then used to summarize the risks. So the list of processes and the ECI and thresholds go to the authorities in member states, so the Cybersecurity National Competent Authority and the National Regulatory Authority, so the regulators both on the cybersecurity and electricity sides, they use that to determine high and critical impact entities. And then each entity also uses this information to determine their internal scope. And that's sort of the top-down part, and then the bottom-up part starts. So it starts with each entity doing their own risk assessment of their own situation. They then provide their own risk to their national regulators. The national regulators summarize the risk for the member state, and they report it then upwards to ENTSO-E and the regional cooperation centers, who make a risk assessment at the regional and European level. And this European risk assessment is then finally used to determine the measures, so particularly the minimum advanced cybersecurity controls that entities need to apply to mitigate the risks. Next slide. So as I said, the entities that are in scope are determined by the impact. So there is a sort of large list of entities in Article 2 that Sabine already discussed, but not all entities need to apply all measures. Well, all entities need to apply some basic measures, so-called cybersecurity hygiene requirements, which make sure that at least everyone has a basic level of security. But the more advanced measures are applied based on impact. So the national authorities, they classify the entities based on these ECI and these thresholds, and they classify them in high impact entities and critical impact entities. And based on this, the actual measures then would be applied. So high impact entities would have to apply the management system and the minimum cybersecurity controls. Critical entities also need to apply that, but on top of that, they also need to have verification and advanced cybersecurity controls. And Christiane will tell more about the exact contents of these measures. Next slide. So just like the national authorities classify entities based on the impact, entities themselves classify their own impacts based or their own assets based on impacts. So all the assets are classified, and they can be classified as high impact or critical impact depending on the impact an entity has on the European electricity grid. And again, they use there this ECAI, this European Cybersecurity Impact Indices. And once this classification of assets has been done, the entity defines different perimeters. So high impact and a critical impact perimeter. The perimeters need to contain all the assets, so the high impact perimeter needs to contain all the high impact assets, the critical impact perimeter, all the critical impact assets, but additionally you need to be able to apply access control on the boundaries on these perimeters. So it means that the perimeter will always be for instance, at a network boundary or at a physical perimeter like a building or specifically secure area. And the perimeters then determine where the measures are applied within an entity. So within the high impact perimeter, you again have the management system and minimum cybersecurity control. Within the critical impact perimeter, you have the same measures, but additionally also the verification and advanced cybersecurity controls. And again, this is a bit of a complex setup in that an entity has to do some work to determine which assets are high impact, critical impact. They have to determine these perimeters. But the major advantage here is that we can really target the measures to the most important assets. So we really are applying the most strict measures to the assets that can really cause damage to the European electricity grid. And this gives a way to efficiently use the scarce cybersecurity resource that we have and to reduce the risks. Next slide. So the risk assessments there, as I said, they will be performed every 2 years. That means we do have quite strict timelines, especially if you take into account the review and consultation process that are part of the risk assessment, because it's very important to get good stakeholder involvement in them. And one practical consequence is that the top-down risk assessment and bottom-up risk assessment are performed in parallel. So you see here the timelines, the blue boxes are the top-down risk assessments, so starting in month 1 and running for the first year. But already while the top-down assessment is running, the bottom-up starts immediately and in the first month of the cycle with the entity-level risk assessment, and then working up to national level and regional level. There are 2 major reporting moments within the cycle. So after the first year, you get the results from the top-down approach, so from the pan-European risk assessment, where the main results are the high and critical impact processes and the ECI and thresholds and the harmonized risk matrix, so the things we discussed before. And then at the end of the second year, there is an overall cross-border electricity cybersecurity report, which also gives the European Commission overview of the cybersecurity risks. It gives the aggregated risk. It gives a regional risk treatment plan for each RCC. And it gives this common electricity cybersecurity framework, which contains the minimum advanced cybersecurity controls, plus a matrix mapping these controls to international standards and national legislation. Next slide. But to be able to start this risk assessment cycle, there needs to be some preparatory work. It needs to be done. So there's a transition period planned. And the transition period has 3 main activities. So in dark blue, you see the development of the methodologies, which Sabine already mentioned. So the risk assessment methodologies are not fixed in the network code itself, but they are developed during this transition period by ENTSO-E, EUD entity, consulting all different stakeholders also through the working group. And then it goes to ACER for approval through the standard process for network code methodologies. So that's the blue line you see here. The other important thing is to identify the high impact and critical impact entities. As said, they would normally be defined based on the risk assessment, but we haven't yet done the risk assessment, so we have to have a sort of transitional list of high and critical impact entities so that they can start their own risk assessment. So this is the gray part where actually some transitional ECI and threshold are determined, and based on that, a transitional list of high and critical impact entities is determined. And finally, we have the green part. This is making a transitional list of international standards. The goal of this transitional list of international standards is to help prepare the entities for implementing the controls, the management system, and the risk management, so that the measures they need to take. So basically, they would get a list of the standards that would be used when implementing the controls, and they can already start preparing it sort of 6 months in the transitional period, so that they have already 1 year before the full before the first risk assessment cycle starts to implement some of the controls and some of the measures needed for the management system and the risk management. So this helps to be better prepared for the start of the risk assessment cycle. So that's the main timeline. So I will hand over then to the information sharing group of Peter Pongras and Olivier.
Thank you, Martin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Peter Pongratz. I'm working for Movir, the Hungarian transmission system operator for electricity. And I have only this one slide where I will be able to describe you the whole information sharing concept we developed for incident and crisis management and the early warning capabilities. So I think we can agree that information sharing is one of the most important elements of a modern day cyber defense system. But in the last decade, we always faced the sad fact that the different European nation-state regulations prevent us to establish an efficient and effective way of information sharing throughout the European electricity grid organizations. Therefore, this topic was an important part of developing this network code on cybersecurity. Based on the ACER framework guideline that was mentioned earlier, we started to develop the concept of this information sharing process. And the basic building block for this process was to build on the risk assessment process Martin just mentioned. And for all the critical impact, high impact electricity entities in Europe, the network code now obligates to establish Security Operations Center services. We know that some of the European electricity sector organizations, even if they fall under the category of critical impact or high impact, are not large enough to build up their own Cybersecurity Operations Center. So we thought that it will be sufficient to build their own cybersecurity operations center or hire a company as a managed security service provider to provide them the cybersecurity operations center service. As you can see on the picture on the left, these MSSPs and SOCs will communicate to their national level cybersecurity incident response team. And on the European level, the CSIRTs will communicate to other national CSIRTs, national level CSIRTs. And on member state level, the CSIRTs will be responsible to collect, sanitize, and distribute the information. We wanted to prevent that the CSIRTs and the electricity sector organizations will suffocate under the huge amount of cybersecurity information that is shared within the sector. So we developed the reportable cybersecurity information category, which will be built up from two sources. This is what you can see on the slide in the bottom right corner. Reportable cybersecurity incident has two aspects: criticality, which can be defined using the incident classification scale methodology developed by ENTSO-E, and using the not so old but really well-known MITRE ATT&CK framework. From these two sources, we can build up the matrix that can be seen in the middle of the bottom right picture, and it can define from which level will be an information or an incident, a reportable one. And in additional articles, we also made some requirements for the incident handling process, also the crisis management process. But in both cases, we only made requirements for cross-border level events or incidents that has cross-border electricity flow effect, because we think that if an incident stays on a nation-state level, then we can let the nation-state handle this event or incident in its own way. And last but not least, what I was talking about in the last couple of minutes, these are all detection and mitigation controls. But we also think that if we can prevent a cybersecurity event or incident or crisis, the better. So together with Acer, and our colleagues from ENISA, we developed an early warning capabilities concept, which will be built up by the European Union. And this will be the set of capabilities that will make it possible to share the most important information that can help us to prevent any cybersecurity incidents with a high level of reliability, but as fast as we can. Thank you. Next slide, Olivier.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Olivier Clément. I'm working for Indices, the French DSO, and I will focus for the next few minutes on cybersecurity exercises. So we are talking here about Title 9, Article 43 to 45. So first, the mandatory exercises concerns only critical impact entities and their suppliers. The network code, just like you see in the graph, proposed to organize 2 exercises every 3 years. The main ideas described in the network code are 3. The first idea is that we believe that practicing is the best way to test processes and to identify what we have to change. Not everything can be settled in the network code, and exercises can easily help us to find what we have to improve. And then we can adapt processes, for example, or whatever. So nothing better than to practice or training to be prepared for a crisis. And we need, of course, to analyze and learn from these exercises. And this is what you will find in Article 45. The second main idea is that we don't want to multiply exercises. Most of us who have already some national exercise in our countries, we just think that, and the network code just explained that we can just not exchange, but we can just make the national exercise of the network code instead of the national exercise, for example, or whatever. The third idea is that organizers should receive scenarios to help them, to support them to organize these exercises. And ENTSO-E will prepare these scenarios. ENTSO-E will receive the support of ENISA, EUDSO, ACER, and I think that's all, to prepare this exercise, these scenarios. So in the graphic, just like I mentioned, you can see in the first line the internal or national exercise prepared on the year of publication +2. So that means 2024, if the year of publication is 2022. ENTSO-E will prepare the scenarios for the 1st January of 2024. And then the exercise, the national exercise or the internal exercise, is supposed to be done in 2025. And the regional and the cross-regional exercise should be done during the third year of the 3-year cycle. That's been in 2026. This is what you see in the second line. Okay, thank you. We can move to next slide, I think.
Hello. Well, welcome for the next part of the network code. So the cross-border cyber risk management and functional security requirements. Myself, I work for the Dutch grid operator Alliander, and my colleague Keith Buzzard is working for ENTSO-E.
Shall I start, Bart?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We've only got a few slides to show you on here, but I'd like to keep this very high level at the moment and explain the principles. So what we're looking at on cyber risk is really the left-hand side of this diagram. And the risk assessment is really the top box. So as Martin's already explained earlier, we're going to look at risk assessment from both a top-down and bottom-up approach. Top-down being really that let's identify what it is the bad guy needs to attack to cause the outages, to cause the problems on the cross-border electricity flows. So if we can identify those key critical business processes, the next step would be the next box down on the left-hand side. What is it that we need to do to protect those processes? What is it we need to do to protect the underlying IT and OT systems that support the business processes? So yeah, we've got a lot of work to do there on coming up with effective controls that I don't think we can totally eliminate risk, but we can reduce risk to the minimum acceptable level. So yeah, identifying security controls and requirements is a key part in that second box. The last part is the next presentation from Martin, I think, but this really these requirements can be fed into the procurement process, and you know, these are our requirements, and when you procure new systems, new components, you can add those requirements in, and yeah, we can get those into the procurement process, which I would suggest is lacking at the moment. Next slide, please. So, okay, I think it's already been mentioned, but we will set up some sort of working group representing all the stakeholders, and ENTSO-E and EU DSO entity will be responsible for that working group. And I just want to give you a flavour of the type of things that this working group will need to do. So I've already mentioned identify critical business processes. We will need to maintain some sort of risk impact matrix to do top-down risk assessment, and it's important that we also identify thresholds based on operational safety limits. We will have to describe quite clearly what we want in terms of bottom-up information coming from the entities, coming from the national authorities. Next one, please. Next slide. Yeah. Yeah, we will need to identify international standards and really do a gap analysis on what's missing, I would suggest. We will need to maintain a regional risk treatment plan. So again, that refers to the controls and requirements. That's how you treat the risk. And a key reporting part will be every number of years we will generate a kind of state of the union type risk assessment report, which clearly identifies the posture, the cybersecurity posture of the electricity sector. So that report obviously should remain pretty confidential or limited in distribution, I would suggest. And finally, I think we've got one more slide. Yeah, I didn't really want to. I think these are covered by some of the other teams. Yeah, particularly the cybersecurity exercises. Going back to Peter Pongratz's presentation, I think it's important to note that we are only there really to monitor the effectiveness of the early warning system. That's actually delegated to ENISA, I believe. So yeah. We just wanted to give you a flavour of the amount of work and the type of work that this working group, as I said, represented by all stakeholders, will need to perform. We need to ramp up pretty quickly. We need to identify these key processes. We need to key critical business processes. We need to tell from a bottom-up approach the type of information we require to do the holistic looking at it from both the bottom up and top down, and then you get this holistic view of the posture of the cybersecurity risk in the electricity sector in Europe. So Bart, I don't know if you want to add anything there. Do you want to add any comments?
Yeah, so the most important thing is just that we want to create a holistic view. So on the one hand, you get a top-down approach, which is initiated by the responsibilities of ENTSO-E and EODSO, which will lead the pan-European risk assessment cycle. On the other hand, you will have a bottom-up approach where you go from member state to regional level to European level, and both should combine, and that should create a holistic view. And that's the task that we face for all of each other, with all our stakeholders. And the working group in the lead of ENTSO-E and EODSO has its commitments for this responsibility.
Yeah. So I think that's it from us. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the overview. So now I wanted to give you an overview about the certification topic. For those of you who've already read the interim report or were following our work pretty closely, they know that we once started with the original idea to achieve a baseline level of security by a mandatory certification of ISO 27001 or equivalent for all grid providers. When you now look at the final legal text, it looks different because the certification topic is much more detailed now, especially after the requirements received by the ASA framework guideline. So certification now is no longer our original idea, but more split it into a risk management at entity level, cybersecurity requirements, verification, an electricity principles standard mapping metrics, and common electricity cybersecurity framework. Can you switch one slide, please? So, and I try to explain a bit more what is behind those words by using the picture that Martin already showed in the general overview. And maybe because I've read a lot of questions in the chat, by the way, to say once again, I don't know who of you already read or had the time to read the legal text of the network code. There is nothing made in stone yet. So as Bart and Keith already mentioned, there will be a lot of work coming up for the working group. And they will develop a lot of points in the transition period. This will take place after the network code comes into force. So there's nothing real detailed clarified yet. But we also have to clarify a lot of points for the certification topics, as already mentioned. Maybe let's come to the cybersecurity hygiene requirements at first, because they have to be implemented by all entities. That means that also small and micro enterprises have to implement those cybersecurity hygiene requirements. For that topic, we already gave a hint in what direction those hygiene requirements shall go. You can read them in Annex A of the network code text. So these are very general requirements, but nevertheless, we are of the opinion that those requirements would help to fix a general level of cybersecurity for all entities. So for the public consultation, please also have a look at those hygiene requirements. We have a question on that point as well in the public consultation. If you have any more suggestions to make here, please feel free to add them. So this is for all entities. We also are saying that for entity level, high impact electricity undertakings have to do a cybersecurity management system according to Article 32 of the network code, and they have to implement minimum cybersecurity controls. The only thing we mentioned is that we are in favor of basing them on an international standard to make them comparable also with other countries. And this is the only hint which is in the text. So there is nothing made of stone for those controls at the moment as well, but this will be the task also of the working group right after the network code comes into force. So there's also a big task for this working group coming up. And for critical impact perimeter and critical entities, we also have the verification topic. And we're saying in the network code that this verification has to be done by certification by an accredited conformity assessment body or a national verification scheme. I think this is important because there are a lot of countries that do have some own national verification schemes in place at the moment based on the NIS directive. And this has to be done not later than 24 months after the Common Electricity Cybersecurity Framework, according to Article 23, which is here in the dotted box, comes into place. To make the work a bit easier, Martin already mentioned that there will be electricity controls and standard mapping metrics. That means that for the cybersecurity controls defined in the network code, there will be a mapping to international standards and national legislative frameworks to make the work easier for the entities to implement controls and just check maybe if you have something based on an international standard, it's already checked for the network code. So this will also be delivered based on the ASA framework guideline. So again, to sum up, there's nothing detailed in the code yet. You will directly see that when you've read the articles. All the work for defining cybersecurity controls, defining the risk assessment process, defining the cybersecurity hygiene requirements will be done by the working group after the network code comes into force. So this is just to sum up, and I think I'm done, and let's switch to the next subgroup.
Yeah, so the next topic is about supply chain security and product assurance. We think that supply chain attacks will be a major risk for smart grid cybersecurity. I think it was already brought to attention last year with the SolarWinds attacks, but even earlier, for instance, Stuxnet could also be seen as a supply chain attack because the attack was initially introduced by a supplier, by an IT supplier. So we think already supply chain attacks are a major risk, and it will probably only increase in the future with the changing international landscape and also the increasing complexity of the supply chain. So to address this risk, the network code includes specific measures to counter these supply chain attacks. But these measures are fully embedded in the normal processes. So we try to embed them fully in a normal risk management process at entity level and also into the risk management process at the European level by ENTSO-E and the EU DSO entity. So there are four major components to the supply chain security management. So first is supply chain security threats. So the idea is that in the union-wide risk assessment, supply chain security threats will be explicitly considered. So in Article 17, there's a list of supply chain threats that need to be considered minimum. And these threats will then also be reported in the cross-border cybersecurity risk assessment report, which then goes to the entities. And the entities are required to also consider the threats in this report when they do their own risk assessment. So this way we ensure that every entity also considers supply chain threats when they do the risk assessment. So they're both considered at European level when determining the advanced minimum cybersecurity controls, and by each individual entity in their own risk assessment when they determine their specific controls. The second part is supply chain security controls. So in Article 24, there's actually a list of specific things that should be covered by the minimum advanced cybersecurity controls to counter supply chain security attacks. So there will be a subset of the minimum advanced cybersecurity controls specifically aimed at supply chain security. And this subset of the supply chain security controls will also be included in the risk treatment plan for entities. That entities all have to apply the minimum advanced cybersecurity control in their high impact and critical impact perimeters. Third part is the harmonized cybersecurity procurement requirements. So this is actually something to support the entities in implementing the controls. And the fourth part is the verification schemes, which also is something to support. And we will discuss this on the next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so as we look at more of the content, so the supply chain controls are actually organizational measures. So there are requirements to the processes that entities do when procuring new products or systems or services. So they sort of put, for instance, a requirement that if an entity procures a new product or system, then they have to set security requirements in their procurement. So for instance, in request for proposals, they have to include requirements covering security, and the supply chain controls also include specific topics that need to be covered by these requirements. And also for critical impact entities, they have to verify these requirements. The requirements they include in the, for instance, request for proposal, they have to verify these requirements before the product goes into operations. Now we see that both these making these requirements and verifying this can be quite a lot of work, can be complex, and can be a lot of effort. So to make this more easy and to facilitate entities doing this, the idea is that ENTSO-E and the EDS entity will actually provide these harmonized security or harmonized cybersecurity procurement requirements and this guidance on verification. So the harmonized security procurement requirements would basically be a requirement set that entities can directly include into their procurement documents. They would be developed by ENTSO-E and the EDSO entity in a rolling work program. So ENTSO-E EDS entity would look at which products or systems are most critical to high impact and critical impact entities. And then for they prioritize then the products and systems, and for the most prioritized products and systems, they would develop these harmonized requirement sets that entities can then easily include into their request for proposals, for instance, and then automatically also meet the supply chain security controls. So they automatically, the topics included in the controls would be covered. The verification guidance, so this is to support the verification process. The goal there is to use the European cybersecurity certification schemes. So the Cybersecurity Act tasked ENISA to develop specific schemes to certify products, systems, and processes. And the goal would be to, as much as possible, use these schemes that are being developed. But the schemes ENISA develops are sort of sector agnostic. They apply to all sectors, and we do expect there is some need to have sector-specific guidance on how to apply these schemes, and that would be the work of the ENTSO-E and the EDSO entity. And the guidance could take different forms. So it could be recommending specific schemes for specific product types. So say, for instance, for smart metering, we think one specific scheme would be the preferred scheme. But could also be developing sort of products that are needed to certify, so the requirements that gets me to certify. For instance, if you would choose common criteria as a scheme for a certain product, then you would have to make a protection profile for the product. And this would also be something that ENTSO-E and the EDS entity would develop. And that's similar for other schemes, like the ICCS scheme has something similar like a protection profile, so it is the GCCA. And the third thing where guidance could be provided is in how to do the evaluation. So what kind of tests would have to be performed, what kind of threats would have to be tested against, and also how would vulnerabilities be ranked in testing, so to make sure that specific threats and vulnerabilities in the smart grid would be properly taken into account during evaluation. So all of this would be developed in a rolling work program where, of course, stakeholder consultation is important. Also, especially important will be the involvement of the different suppliers, the manufacturers of the equipment, so that we also use their specific knowledge to develop both the requirement sets and the verification. And the hope is that by providing the requirements and the verification guidance, will be much easier for the entities to actually meet the supply chain controls. Thank you. Next slide.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Martin. Now, Alina, Christian, I think we can progress with the next session. That is an open session, a discussion session, where all participants are advised and encouraged to take the floor and raise your hands and put questions so the team can give you feedback. Thank you.
So I'm keeping an eye on the hand raised, and I see nothing for now, but let's wait a bit.
Just to break the ice, as we have some, if people that have already posted question in the chat wants to take the floor, raise the hands and put the question in verbally, we are glad to take them.
Okay, I see one raised hand by Nicolas Roger Marchat. So please, Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Elena. I was wondering if we could come back on the minimum and advanced controls that are foreseen as part of the common cybersecurity framework, because I understand that those are additional controls that will be defined further later on in the process. But I was wondering whether there's already some indications of what those minimum and advanced controls would actually contain. I mean, you know, if I just look at the naming of those controls, it looks and sounds a bit as the minimum and advanced requirements that were set up in the table 2 of the framework guidelines. But when I try to compare a bit this table 2 with the network code, I see that most of the points of the table of the framework guidelines are already contained in the code. And then I wonder whether those minimum and advanced controls are meant to cover other elements, and if so, what? And yeah, asking all that because there would definitively then be additional requirements that we would have to comply with, but it's a bit of a black box for the time being.
Maybe I can start to answer the question, and everyone can jump in and add some points. To be honest, at the moment, it is still kind of a black box because, as already mentioned, we need first to identify which are the critical processes, which are the critical entities. And this will be done in the transition phase by the working group. So a lot of work to do there, and they will focus then on the minimum cybersecurity controls, and they will, based on those critical processes, try to fix some controls that match for critical impact parameter and high impact parameters. So it is still kind of a black box. So there's no list existing at the moment. We're trying to keep it based on international standards as much as possible, but this is something that has really to be done by the working group. So this is something that will be done in the further processes.
If I can just elaborate on what Christian was saying, there is also a technical or, you know, a subject matter reason for this. And this is, as you have seen in the timeline, we started to work in this on this network code in 2019, and we expect to have it into force in the end of 2022. It's a 3 years period. What happens if something changes in the cybersecurity threat scenario? There are new threats, new technologies in this time. This is something that a network code, as it is a European regulation, can't really keep up the pace of cybersecurity with the hard carved in stone regulation. It is important to have a flexible approach that can react quickly in regarding the security requirements and how the electricity sector reacts to a new threat and to new vulnerabilities that emerge. And this is the reason why this is part of the answer to your question.
Thanks a lot. I think that really clarifies, and definitively I hear the argument about the need to keep some flexibility, because indeed that's an ever evolving piece of legislation. But I'm still wondering whether, you know, maybe we could frame a bit more the scope or the type of obligations that could arise through those minimum and advanced controls, so that, you know, for those on the other side, we will have to implement, we have a bit more of an understanding of the, you know, the objectives, the type, the main type of obligations that could come up. And just because I monopolized the floor, I was wondering also if you could maybe explain a bit more the relationship, the interplay between the different places where those minimum and advanced requirements are mentioned. I think for the time being, they are mentioned both in Article 21 and 23. In Article 21 as the result of the Regional Cybersecurity Risk Treatment Plan, and in Article 23 as in part of the scope of the Common Electricity Cybersecurity Framework. And because they are both mentioned in different places, then there's a bit of unclarity on what would be the regime for their elaboration, and among others, whether they would be consulted upon and subject to regulatory approval. Thank you very much.
I will just ask Andrea or Christiane if they would like to add anything else to the comments that Nicolas has put.
I can just, Alina
Keith Buzzard here. Let me give you.
Okay, I would just answer the legal question from Nicolas, and which procedure will be followed, whether they will be consulted or not. So it's not a content answer. It's in Article 5. So they are listed among the deliverables of Article 5, which means full stakeholder consultation by the working group, which will be set up, and also by the standard public consultation procedures. So it's so that there is no doubt that we don't develop it in our corner. Thanks.
Thank you, Sabine. Keith, you would like to add?
No, let me give you maybe a good example of a difference between advanced and not advanced. So if somebody fits into that critical impact perimeter, what we're saying there is that the business process and the underlying IT or OT system is so important that if it's successfully cyber attacked, the impact will be blackouts or massive disturbance. And something in the high impact perimeter would be something like, if it was successfully cyber attacked, it wouldn't cause the blackout or the disturbance, but combined with other factors that could really lead to problems. So that's the type of analysis we need to do. We need to identify these critical and high impact business processes, the underlying IT OT operating systems. But let me give you a control which I think should be in a critical impact perimeter. And we have TSOs, I'm sure DSOs also. They have things like passive anomaly detection type systems. So those systems should sit in the background and look for something that's out of the ordinary, that shouldn't be there, traffic that's new or never been seen before. For me, that's the type of control that should go into this advanced security critical impact perimeter. But you could argue that you necessarily don't need to have that in the high impact or lower levels of perimeter. So I think there's a lot of discussion needs to take place on, you've identified your crown jewels, what you really need to protect. Now, what are these advanced cybersecurity controls and requirements that effectively protect us from the bad guy causing the damage? And that's a lot of work coming our way, and will take many months or years to get right, I would suggest.
So what we should do is that we identify the critical business processes, and that's the basis to identify the crown jewels, the key assets, which should be in the right perimeter. And for each perimeter, you should have the right controls.
Right.
So it's all about linking the processes to the assets based on the risks. And of course, the risks in the first place start with the business processes. But you take a look at the whole value chain of the energy system, which processes are really key, which crown jewels, which assets are needed for the critical business process, and that are the crown jewels. And those crown jewels should be protected by the right security controls. And helping to identify the perimeters is of course a model to have only the most strict security controls for the highest risks.
I agree.
Okay, thank you very much for this. I will move on and I will give the floor to Sophie Kaiser.
Yes, thank you very much. I have two questions, not that long. First is about the scope in Article 2. It says that a minimum cybersecurity provisions apply to the following entities, and also the regulator is listed under that, and also the Risk Preparedness Authority. And I was wondering, if I read it like very literally, then the regulator have to supervise itself. If it's like this is under here, what's the intention, or how do you see this?
I think the question is to me, Sabine speaking. I don't see why you say the regulator has to supervise himself.
Because it says that the cybersecurity provisions should apply to the following entities, and like in this there's like they made a different list for the regulatory authority, so that's what I was a little bit worried.
Okay. I think the oversight issue there is for each entity. There is another one. Let's say, for example, for the TSOs, it will be the NRA, so the regulators. But for the regulators, of course, it can't be the regulator itself. It must be a higher entity. So this is not covered. So let's say when we talk about regulatory oversight, it's mainly how we oversee the implementation, mainly of the deliverables, so how they are developed. And then ASA has to monitor. It's a general, let's say, role that ASA has according to the ASA regulation, the implementation of network codes. So in general, so not only for the cyber code, but in general. So they will monitor whether it's correctly implemented or not, or how it's implemented and the timing. So it's not the NRA which will oversee itself. So if this replies to your question.
Yes, thank you very much. And also very short check question. In the draft, there was explicitly it said that member states can appoint CSIRTs, and now there is in the network code you refer to Article 9. Is this still the intention, or because Article 9 also gives member states the possibility to appoint CSIRTs, or how do you see this?
The CSIRT appointment or designation is we already dealt with in the NIS directive, so we didn't duplicate what member states can do with the CSIRTs, so that there is no contradiction. I think that's maybe because Article 9 for me it's recovery of costs, so I don't we don't have the same articles maybe, but
yeah, sorry, I mean Article 9 in this directive, but you already answered my question, so thank you.
Yeah, okay. Fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I move on and I hand over to Ingo Jensen.
Yes, hi everybody. I'm working for a medium DSO, and I was concerned about the question about the benchmarking approach. The benchmarking approach wants to compare average expenditures for cybersecurity measures. It's Article 13, and I just want to point out that IT costs are very, very different inside the European Union. One country has man-hour fees around 10 euros, and the other country has 50 euros per hour. And those costs will add up and will change prices. And it will be very, very hard to compare average expenditures in the way Article 13 is now created. I just want to point out that different IT costs will be different from region to region, and this should be somehow considered inside the benchmarking done by ASA. So my recommendation would be to add some lines to, let's say, normalize the expenditure data in order to make it comparable between member states. Otherwise, you will compare things that cannot be compared, at least not in a productive way. Thank you.
Christiane,
So
thank you.
this was only a remark, or shall we comment on this?
Just consider it in the
Okay.
in the next do-over. You said nothing is written in stone or something, and so I think that every remark and every hint helps to make things better.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Before taking the next question, I'm just a really kind request for all people taking the floor. Please, as we are taking notes in the meantime, please, if you can kindly present yourself so we can take better notes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. The next raised hand is from Bart Thomasse.
Yeah, this is Bart Thomasse from Agentschap Telecom, the CSNCA in the Netherlands. I've got a question. In earlier phases, we tried to harmonize risk assessments. And then we noticed that if we try to aggregate different risks, that it often went wrong. So I was wondering if there is also a kind of basic set of standardized risks, so that the aggregation will be a lot less complex.
Yeah, maybe I can answer that. So the idea would be to aggregate the risk per process. So this is where the list of high and critical impact processes comes in. So the list is made at the European level, and basically the entities would report per process the risk of a compromise of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And in this way, we get the same list of risks for each of the entities. Plan is also to do some synchronization in the threads. So there would be also a list of threads in the risk report, the cross-border regional risk report. But it's more used as guidance, so to make sure that at least all these threats would be considered by the entities. It's not the idea to report the risk on a threat basis, but only to report on a process basis. That makes sense to you? Okay.
Yeah, very good. And I also have another point which also has to do with the point Ingo made. We also saw in one of the benchmarking that it's very difficult to determine the cybersecurity expenditures because they are integrated. So an entity does not know what a particular solution costs with cybersecurity and without cybersecurity. So I think the benchmarking is always very also complex to do. Because you do not know what the cybersecurity part of your solution costs. Is that also taken into account?
Let's say the ones who drafted the code have the same difficulty.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sabine, for this politically correct answer.
Yes, but it's like this in the framework guideline. So, but I agree that we will have to look into it because everybody faces the same issue.
Okay, thank you.
May I add something which probably relates to this topic? In multiple parts of the network code, for example, Article 19, it states that financial impact is not considered in the risk analysis. And I think that is structurally wrong because a lot of risk comes from financial impact. And if you don't consider those financial impact, you probably might lose the most important route for an incentive in cybersecurity. And therefore, I would recommend to think over the parts of the network code where it states we will not consider financial impact in our risks, because this, from my point of view, is incorrect.
Well,
Just
thank
one
you for the-
one clarification question to Mr. Jensen. So you mean the financial damage we should consider also, because I don't think it talked about risks in the article. That's your point.
Yeah. I mean financial
The damage.
financial
Okay.
damage, yes. And
Okay,
because
thank
Financial impact.
yeah,
Sure.
because this is a business impact. Financial impact is also a business impact, and I can understand that you have to drill down some tasks and that you have to make it easy in order to achieve your goal. But if you leave out financial damages and only work on business process layer and not without any financial impacts, I'm afraid that the world doesn't work like this, and then there might be some results which cannot deal with reality. Sorry.
Okay, maybe just take on this. Thank you for the point. Okay, as Keith pointed out, we are not taking into account the financial damages, and this is because the risk approach is aiming to manage the cyber risk on cross-border electricity flows, and this is a mainly operational damage and impact that is taken into account. Of course, financial analysis are in the scope of the benchmarking part of the network code, as Sabine has been explaining. So actually a kind of a cost-effective analysis between the diminishing of risk with the application of the network code with the on one side, and the cost of cybersecurity measure implemented to implement the network code. This is some kind of cost analysis and cost benefit analysis that will be done, and actually it can be fed back in the regulatory scheme you were referring to. But yeah, if on the same side, if you, for example, another kind of risk that another damage scenario we didn't consider is, for example, the public image of damage. So actually, when some entity gets attacked, it is, of course, goes in the press, and there is a damage associated with this, where the network code is not aiming to take into consideration this kind of damage, because it's the view is mainly operational. So the impact assessment is made main on operational scope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have also Yunus Javad with a hand raised, so I will give the floor. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Javad from Fronis International. We are like a inverter manufacturer. So my question is related to supply chain. The first question is, which entity on the EU level is representing the part of the inverter manufacturers or supply chain entity, because we are also a stakeholder. So that's one part of the question. The second part of the question is, for example, when it comes to standardization or global groups, for example, because we are supplying these inverters to different stakeholders across the world, for example, in US, in Europe as well. So there is a definition of standards. So who will be the source party when it will come to risk management? Will there be an entity like Solar Power Europe would be representing us, or in this part, or which will be directly dealing with our stake? That's the question.
Yeah, so let me answer. So for representation, so one part of representation would be in the cybersecurity risk working group. There the idea would be indeed to use associations, but I think it's not fixed yet which association would represent which stakeholders. I think this is something also to be considered when the group is actually being set up. And besides, of course, the working group, there will always be public consultations on the requirements and the verification guidance. So there's also an option to have direct influence on this. Concerning your your question about international harmonization or international standardization, I think the main goal for the verification would be to align with the European cybersecurity certification scheme. So the things that are being developed by ENISA, as this is European regulation, and the Cybersecurity Act is sort of the main regulation on certification in this area. So that is the main goal. But we do see, and we also expect that in the future, ENISA will be following international standards. So they're using, for instance, at the moment, common criteria or IEC 62443. So they are definitely looking also for alignment with the US and Japan and other markets. And we hope that will be this case in the future. But again, the European market is our main focus.
Okay, understood. So how do you say that the stakeholder would be announced later? Like, for example, I had a talk with ENCS, and they said they represent only grid operators, TSOs, and DSOs. So that was something which was missing. So this is why I pointed out. Okay.
Yes, no, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Ron Spuybrook.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon. Thank you for all the information. I posted a question in the chat. Is it possible to link the advanced cybersecurity controls to the restrained EU level? This is known in all nation states in the EU. So it might be much easier to have a level that more institutions understand.
As already mentioned, there will be a mapping of those standards in the standard mapping metrics, and this will be a deliverable by the working group as well. So we are not, as already mentioned, we are not in the statutes that we can say what are we mapping on which level, but we can take this under consideration, and we're trying to map all the national legislation and the international standards together to the cybersecurity controls and requirements we define in the network code. So thank you for the tip, and there's nothing in place yet, but the working group will take that under consideration.
Yeah, because a lot of security standards have their own ideas, and we have about 200 security standards now. So it would be nice if we can use the European one for it. But just a tip. Thank you for your answer. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Maybe if Ron could lower down his hand, just not to double count. Nicolas, I see your hand raised again.
Thank you very much. I wanted to come back on a more general topic, maybe, i.e. on governance, and wondering, because I think during the presentation there was mentioned that it would be a working group with a lot of powers to be active and defining a lot of deliverables. My understanding is that actually the network code is more into a position where this working group is in support of the activities of ENTSO-E and or the EU DSNTT, who are eventually the one in charge of those deliverables. So if there could be a first clarification here, that would be very welcome. And actually, I was wondering if you could explain further the need to have this working group, as I was understanding it to be, let's say, a forum where the different market participants, the different stakeholders could intervene and, let's say, provide guidance, expertise to ENTSO-E and the EU DSNTT on how to best implement the deliverables of the network code. And it seems that it's more or less the same approach that is taken under the already existing network codes in the framework of the European stakeholder committees. So I was wondering why not reuse the format of a European Stakeholder Committee and develop instead a working group? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Nicolas. Is well received, this kind of suggestion, and we, as you know, we are completely open to stakeholder. As you joined, you yourself, you are part of the development team in the drafting committee, so I'm sure we can try to tailor this kind of suggestion in the following phases. Thank you.
Maybe just to add what Andrea said, I'm not sure that the stakeholder committees have clear deliverables, to be honest. So I think the mandate of this working group is a bit more stricter to what the output will be. So it's not just a presentation of the ongoing work. So I think there is a difference on how the stakeholders are working together with ENTSO-E and ENTSO entity. It's not just a hearing, let's say it like this, or an open discussion. It's a bit more. That's the idea behind.
Okay, but just to bounce back, is it then that we could just put in like one sentence that the ENTSO-E and or EUDS entities, when working on those deliverables, must engage with the stakeholders in the European Stakeholder Committee, and then that creates this obligation to involve the stakeholders?
It's already in the code text. I can't find the article, but there is an article saying that they have to.
There's already an article on consultation.
No, it's not the same on consultation. It's not the same on consultation, but it's somewhere else, but we will check.
Okay. Thank you. And maybe just it's a similar reasoning, then I assume that we could also expand as to the existence of this monitoring body, which I understand is a sort of fancy way to say that ESA needs to consult with a series of stakeholders before adopting its own decisions. And maybe that would be easier to just say that indeed ESA needs to consult rather than create this new body and force, let's say, an organization on ESA.
I think it's the same. It's not the same scope. ESA has anyway the obligation to consult also stakeholders. So I think it doesn't replace, and the monitoring body is not a stakeholder body for, let's say, private stakeholders. It's more a coordination body for the public institutions that have to input to or help ESA to coordinate. I think it's another setting. So there is no link with the approval procedure. So ESA can use it, but must not use it. So I think this was the idea. So the setup is different.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure to understand exactly how that will work. I see that there's quite a lot of bodies quite a lot of legal public entities that are listed as being members of the monitoring body, for instance. And from top of my head, there's like 30 persons in the room. And I'm not quite sure of how that would work in practice, whether everyone would have a vote, whether there would be consultation, whether it's ESA chairing and therefore getting the feedback from those 30 persons. Yeah, so it's not quite clear for me at the time being.
Okay, I think for your last comment or question, Nicolas, most of us don't have the answer, so that's why the quiet around the table. I will hand over to Jörg Seifert.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Jörg Seifert. I work for a German utility, and I'm also chairman of the Smart Grid Coordination Group of Senselec and ETSI. And I would like to make a comment on standards and also have a question. Regarding the standards situation, I think the issue of standardization have now been addressed several times. And speaking for European Standards Organization, we are more than happy to have a liaison with this group in terms of there are new requirements on European standards. For example, if there are new use cases, or we can provide any kind of support in cybersecurity standardization requests, we are more than happy to do so. And we also have ENTSO-E as an important stakeholder in our initiatives beside European Commission. And please use this interface in order to address issues and questions, because potentially we see different stuffs now arising from this network code. For example, the certification of equipment might be a new field where international standards need to be adopted or also need to be developed. And this is a potential issue for European standardization. So please make use of existing interface or address me directly if there are any inquiries regarding that. And my question is on penalties, because what happens if any body which is mentioned or has obligations from a network code is disregarding requirements? And I see it a bit different, because when I look at the GDPR, the penalty issue is addressed, but I can see no penalty issue in the current draft of the network code. So what will happen in case of violations regarding the network code? Thank you.
Sabine, do you want to elaborate on the question for the first part of the statement? Thank you very much for, of course, for the proposal to collaboration is something that is always welcome. And,
yeah, I can quickly answer. There are no penalties inside because it's there is no enforcement body at European level who can impose a penalty. So the only enforcement powers lies within the NRAs. So there is no general penalty article in this network code at the moment foreseen. That's only I can say. I hope everybody will comply. So it depends on the penalty. Well, like what penalties will be there? It will be the national penalties in the end. So the NRAs have already the enforcement power to penalize, or financial penalty, administrative penalties, whatever exists, and it's different in all the different member states. And I don't think it's the network code is the right place to harmonize the penalty scheme in Europe. So we didn't find, let's say, the need to put something specific in for now. You still can convince us otherwise.
Okay, thank you for this explanation.
Thank you. For now, there are no more raised hands. And maybe until the participants think about additional questions. Okay, Sabine. No, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alina. I just want to turn the question around. The question to the participants. Do you consider also replying to the public consultation in writing? So not only to the workshop or workshops, just to have a feeling of whether you consider
maybe you can do a raise of hands for that question.
That's a good idea. I lower my hand. I won't reply to the consultation.
Okay. So I see quite a
thank you.
few
Thank
people.
You for this, of course. And also regarding those questions for whom the answer was too complex to give it today, just yes, absolutely take advantage of public consultation ongoing to reformulate in writing, and it will be properly managed during the public consultation process. Thank you.
Moreover, we have during this week, we have also attached to the public consultation an Excel file with a list of questions that are actually posed in the public consultation tool. And this is to facilitate for the stakeholders, the internal alignment that you will need to have in order to respond to the public consultation. So I'm not sure if everyone have seen this, but we have added this document as an extra to the public consultation. Nicolas?
Yes, thank you very much. I feel like I'm stealing the floor, but since no one else has their hand raised, I will take the opportunity. Actually, I wanted to go on a slightly different topic, which is on the protection of information, and especially under the title of confidentiality. So in this area, I actually have 3 questions. And I would say the first one is with regard to the list of the entities, those who are qualified as high impact and critical impact. I think I've read in the draft network code that bear with me if I'm not entirely correct, but my understanding is that it is foreseen that the transitional list would be published, but not the final one, or vice versa. And I believe that would be good that all the lists are kept confidential. So is there a specific thinking behind that, or could we move everything as confidential list? So that would be the first question. Then a second one would be to ask you if you have already considered the potential risk that there could be in case of all the information that is collected at the entity level and reported up is centralized and is actually leaked, or that a cyber pirate is putting its hand on it. Would that create an additional risk for this information? For instance, for all the vulnerabilities that could be identified if they end up in the hands of cyber pirates, what do we do and how do we protect that from happening? And the third question would be actually if you could walk us through a bit on the Title 10 of the draft network code. It sets up a lot of high-level principles on how to ensure the confidentiality, but I must say I was a bit lost and I was not entirely sure to understand who has to do what in terms of protecting the information. So maybe if you can dumb it down for me and explain how do we ensure the protection of information in light of the Title 10. Thank you very much for this jumper question.
I think the list is the topic of Keith. Can you answer the question?
Say that again, sorry.
The topic of the list and the confidentiality of the list of the critical entities and processes. Can you answer the question? How can we ensure the confidentiality?
For the time being, I think I've read that the list would be published in one case, I think the transitional one, and not published for the final list of entities. And it seemed, I fear that that would create a risk actually if the list of entities was to be made public, because then that would basically signal the level of security measures that are put in place, and therefore for cyber pirates that would be an indication of who has what level of protection and how to best hack them.
It has the information needs to be protected. There's no doubt about that. It has to be protected properly.
The reason that the transitional list is made public is that it's explicitly included in the framework guidelines. I think this is something maybe we need to consider more closely, but this was the reason why the transitional list is made public.
Okay, so maybe a point to modify and then justify to ESO why we keep it confidential.
Yes, absolutely. And also to further elaborate, this is also, we're striving to find a balance between the transparency of the procedure and the protection of the information. Because of course, this working group that will be set to work on the operational and the current operation of a network code. Will be on one side transparent in its operation, and on the other side we provide proper protection of the information to the compliance with the common sense, and also national classification and protection of information, of course.
Okay. Is it sufficient for answering your questions, Nicolas?
That's an answer for the first point. I don't know whether you have the possibility to also address the second and third point. So the second point was in case of, in the bottom-up risk assessment with a list of vulnerabilities being aggregated from the entity level to the national level, then regional and European level. Is there a risk that actually cyber pirates identify where the list of vulnerabilities is aggregated at European level, then hacking this list, and therefore having a global overview of where to hack all the entities? And then isn't it a risk that we would be facing?
Maybe I'm looking at Bart or Andrea. I see that he would like to also jump in.
Yes, okay. This is, of course, the information is shared upwards, because it must fit the product security cycle. If you don't know your vulnerabilities, you actually don't know what kind of security controls to enforce in a supply chain. So this is for sure a topic. Then, of course, these are very sensible information, because we are talking about vulnerabilities on devices and systems in critical infrastructures, and that's why probably the list will be protected with anonymization of the entities involved in vulnerabilities, and whatever security measures and confidentiality measure will be needed. But actually, there is a reason why this list of vulnerabilities is projected upwards, because then you can have a feedback down with the security requirements in the supply chain.
Okay, no, definitely I hear and understand the interest of sharing the information up, but indeed there was more around the mechanisms that we are putting in place to avoid any leak, or that any ill-intended party put its hand on this information that I was more asking. So correct me if I'm misrepresenting what you said, but I hear that there would be more anonymization processes and additional confidentiality rules to be put in place so that we avoid any risk. Is that correct?
Yes, of course. Today, as already all the members of the development team already expressed, we are in no position to give you exact details of the measures, because this is something for the working group to define. But if we speak about general criteria, anonymization is a key concept, minimization of information. So, for example, if we were talking about feeding up the vulnerabilities, probably we do not need to link vulnerabilities with entities, and this is something that will be considered, at least in the working group. So if we talk about general concepts, we can talk about minimization, anonymization, and of course protection of the essential information that will be exchanged in the workflow. Yes, that's it. I don't know, Martin, if you want to elaborate on this on the product assurance.
Yeah, no, I think for the product assurance, I mean, we need some information, but I mean, indeed, an anonymized information is enough. But maybe as a more general action, I think we have been thinking a lot about this risk. So the risk of this, if you gather this information, then there is risk that attackers would get it. What we've really done, I think, throughout the bottom-up risk assessment part is to try to minimize the information that is being gathered upwards, and also to try to anonymize it. So, for instance, if you go from the national level to the EU level, we don't share information about individual entities. So, at the member state level, there's an anonymization step where the individual entities sort of disappear, and that's not normally reported upwards. There are some restrictions in this because also European Commission sort of has some need for information, or ACER expressed some need for information in its cross-border cybersecurity risk assessment report, and information that needs to be in this report we need to gather from this bottom-up analysis. So that's sort of the restriction in why we're sometimes asking more detailed information about vulnerabilities or threats or the derogations. These are explicit requests for from ACER framework guidelines to report this in a cross-border risk assessment report. So if we need to report that to the Commission, then we sort of need to gather this. So this is why we're sometimes gathering more than maybe strictly necessary to do just the risk assessment. And I think compared to protection, I think we will get a lot of confidential information both at sort of European level and at the CS, NCA, and NRA. And I think this is also one of the reasons why they are included in the list of the entities in scope. So they would also probably be considered as sort of critical impact entities given the amount of information they would have about the electricity grid, and would have to then also take corresponding measures to protect this information. So I think this is one of the reasons to include them explicitly in the scope of the network code. Hope this somewhat also answers your question, Nicola.
Yes, thank you very much.
And maybe for the third question, I'm not sure if any of the colleagues could also provide a feedback on the confidentiality description.
I can try to jump in concerning Title 10 because we worked a little bit on that title. So there is 3 categories concerning the classification of the level of confidentiality of the information. The first one, the most important one, is the EU classified information, and this is the top secret information. The second one is the sensitive non-classified information, and then we suggest to use the TLP protocol, especially concerning the chapter, the title, 8. And the last one is the unrestricted information. This is the TLP white, of course, you know that quite well. In Article 48, we explain what the entity that send information have to do, and what the entity receiving the information have to do too. This means they have to protect the information, they have to distribute the information internally, externally, according to the TLP protocol. And we also explained that the CSIRT has what they have to do, and in order to anonymize and sanitize the information. The objective is really to avoid any harm to the entity, the electricity entity. I don't know if you have one more precise question, or if it answers to your question.
Thank you very much. To be honest, I'm still a bit confused. I think I read in Article 11, 46, 47, and 48. In each of those articles, there was a classification that was required. Is that a repeat, or is that 3, 4 different classifications?
Yeah, I agree with you. We have to align Article 11, 47, and 48. This is something that we have to work on. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. No, because that's true. Huh? That's really true.
Okay, many thanks. Bart, Tomasse?
Yeah, I was triggered by the previous question about transparency, and I'm bringing up maybe an old point, but I'm wondering if the current transparency doesn't have a negative impact on security. Yeah? For example, if I take a look at the ENTSO-E transparency platform, then I would think that is a very nice dashboard for hackers. So I wondered if you're also taking a look at that part of the yeah, of the information. Is my question clear?
I think so. I think this will also be a thing that will be done in the transition phase. So looking at all the risks and identifying the risks will be part of the work that the working group has to do. And this was not topic of the drafting of the working code, so the network code. So there's no part that is in the network code legal text at the moment, which is dealing on exactly those risks. So we don't have a reference on this, but we can note this and take it under consideration during the transition phase.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you. No more hands raised at this stage. Maybe I take advantage just to read some of the remaining questions in the chat, and I'll just ask the team if they can provide the feedback. One question with no answer yet is about what is the definition of an entity at the level of the risk description, or a physical installation or a company. So if any of the colleagues could provide a feedback for this question, or maybe Eric, the Kinderen could clarify.
Yes, what I wanted to know is at the moment that you have several wind turbines made by manufacturer A, what is the operated by, let's say, another company residing in another country, and what is then an entity? Is that each physical wind turbine? Is that the manufacturer, because the wind turbines are connected to the dispatch of that manufacturing company? Or is it the financial institution residing in the United States and legal owner of those wind turbines? That was my question.
Sabine, do you want to go?
Yes.
Because it's
Sabine,
defined. It's defined in the definitions under number 30. We have a definition for electricity entity.
Maybe you go to the backup slide, which we need finally, Eileen. I'm not sure whether it really answers in detail the question. So I think we should get back to it in the backup. Yeah, this one. This is what is written in the scope. So we just take mainly the definitions that are already in existing legislation, which means, to answer your question, you have to check whether the owner of the wind park falls under the Electricity Undertaking Directive, which I think he does. The question is just which criticality he will be assigned to. But this, I think we will look into it to give a more detailed answer to your question. But this is, I mean, the scope is very broad. As we said in the beginning, it covers nearly the whole electricity sector, but it's limited first to cybersecurity and to cross-border electricity flows. So it's not, let's say, any cybersecurity incident in the electricity sector. So this is something, it's difficult to read this in, I think, in the text itself, because we cannot really frame it at the moment, but it's something we have to keep in mind in the application of the network code and when developing the deliverables, including the defining the thresholds and the parameters and the risks, that it's always with a focus on cross-border electricity flows in cyber. Maybe this helps already, but I think it's a question we will take with us.
Okay, thanks for this information.
Thank you. There are two questions from Ingo Jensen, one on risk assessment. which is already done in the regulation 941. And if that was considered in the network code, or why the new risk management process appears in the network code, why a new risk management process appears.
Maybe I can take on this, Alina. Of
Sure,
course, thank you for the question, Mr. Hingo. And of course, the answer is yes. As you for sure know, the methodology 941 was proposed by ENTSO-E and applied in all the member states. And yes, actually, the network code is it's also referenced in the text of the network code, and we are taking into account the relationship with the risk preparedness regulation and the network code risk management process that's been described. So absolutely is something that is in the scope of the network code itself. Of course, the risk preparedness asked all the operators and at entity level, and then at member state level with the national preparedness, risk preparedness plans, etc., to map all the risks for the electricity system, and we know from the results of this general assessment that cyber risk was ranked quite high in the ranking. So I think in some countries even top 3, and so it's of course is something that we took into account. Of course, if you have some specific points about how the proposed risk management process described in the network code doesn't fit in the general framework of risk preparedness, just please let us know, because maybe something that we overlooked, and we are still in time to make any correction. But the intent of the drafting team was definitely to be coherent with the regulation 941 from 2019.
Okay.
Did I answer your question, Mr. Ringo?
Yeah, no problem. Thanks.
Thank you to you.
And if I come back to the second point made, I think this is one comment to be taken into consideration, maybe by Christiane and the team on the basic security hygiene measures. There are some suggestions for Annex A, so to be considered. And
may I add? Sorry for interrupting.
Yes.
But
no worries, please.
is what bothers me a lot, because a lot of people will be bothered by this security hygiene page, and this Annex A is not really applicable from my point of view. It's too technical, and it's lacking one important part. Security starts with responsibility. It's important to have someone who's responsible for security, and this Annex A, with this basic or ultra low security requirements, let's say, let's call them that. These ultra low security requirements don't even have someone responsible for cybersecurity, but this is the first step in order to establish security. So the security hygiene requirements must enforce these small and little businesses to make someone responsible for cybersecurity, and to have a, let's say, a person that can be asked or that has to answer cybersecurity questions. And this needs to be addressed, from my point of view, in Annex A. So please reconsider what is written in Annex A, because the technical measures, they look good, but they don't establish security in an organization that is very small.
Yeah, maybe let's just say that the network code itself is focused on the cross-border electricity flows and the risks for the pan-European for the pan-European grid. When it comes to small and micro entities, they do not really do a risk to this whole system or the system as a whole. But they are in the focus or in the scope, for example, for the NIS directive. So the reason why cybersecurity hygiene requirements appear in our network code at the moment is the ASA framework guideline, to be honest, because in the first steps we didn't take those SMEs under consideration. But if you think there's something missing in this very general points, please, as I already mentioned, please comment in the public consultation. There is a question, especially on this topic, what is missing, because at the moment it's just a collection of things from other legislations we found. So we're happy to add points there.
Maybe just to add something, how this was constructed in the framework guideline, it says we based the basic cyber hygiene requirements on the recommendations of ENISA. So there were some indications, at least in a paper from ENISA from 2017. And I think the annex is a resume of what is already established by ENISA. And it also, I think it's already mentioned in the annex. So as Christiane said, if you have proposals what has to be included additionally, we can do this. And it's just to tell you where they are coming from at the moment. So it's taken from already established papers since 2017.
Okay, thank you. There was an additional comment from Ingo on the verification guidance. And the question is if it's not better to be provided by a professional accredited conformity testing body.
I'm not sure if like a conformity assessment body will provide it, because they will provide conformity assessment against different standards, so they will not probably give guidance about which thing, but I think definitely they will also be sort of part of the groups consulted when preparing this guidance. So I think they're definitely an important group to consult when making the guidance, but we wanted to put responsibility for making the guidance also with the risk owners, so the high impact, critical impact entities, because they have a sort of a good overview also of where the risks lie and what should be done to mitigate the risks. But of course, the sort of technical recommendations about the standards and the testing would come from both conformity assessment bodies, national cybersecurity certification authorities, industry. So the idea is also to gather information from all these parties with their own specific expertise for this purpose.
Thank you, Martin. The next question in the chat is actually similar with the previous one provided by Eric, and where we have already answered is by Karina Medved-Regar, and it's about the definition of an entity and the scope that falls under the network code. A next question comes from Eric de Kinderen. Do you have a procedure if a virus such as Stuxnet is able to infect the whole electrical system? Did you describe also the process to go to the previous normal system, or is it out of the scope of the network code?
Yes, I suppose that all the participants know exactly what Stuxnet did in Iran a few years ago. And I have somewhere the impression if a hostile country wants to infect the complete European system, by, for instance, inserting a virus in all the inverters used in photovoltaic systems, that photovoltaic panels, that it's quite impossible to build a firewall against that. My question is, at the moment that such a Stuxnet-like virus is detected, okay, what are you going to do? Is this also the subject of this code, or is it outside this code?
I can try to answer to this question. I think, yes, this is inside the network code, but not about specifically Stuxnet. But in Article 40 and Article 39, and after all the Title 8, we are talking about the crisis management, the detection of incidents, and what we have to do when we have such kind of crisis. In the first articles of Title 8, we are describing how we have to share the information in case of any incident. If we share the information, this is just to be informed and to inform all the electricity entity to be able to protect themselves. This is really important. This is really something that we want to do. And in the case that we have a crisis, we believe that we have to build some ad hoc coordination group between the countries to be able to coordinate the effort to understand what's happening exactly, where we are to try to find the problems and how we can solve the problem as soon as possible. And of course, the idea is also to give the information to the electricity entity. So yes, I think to answer to your question, we try to answer to such kind of problem through Title 8, yes.
It's in Article 24, letter C, diversity of ICT products, and this protects against Stuxnet.
Oh, you want to see that one through the supply chain, isn't it? Or what?
In Article 24, letter C, it says you have to consider certain things in supply chain security, and this also says diversify your products. And if you don't have a monoculture, you can protect in general by Stuxnet.
Okay, maybe Martin, if you want to answer concerning Article 24.
Well, I think, I mean, this is definitely one of the reasons behind it. It may not be the only solution, but definitely it helps a lot if there is some diversification, both to make sure that indeed one vulnerability in one type of equipment will not compromise the entire grid, and also sort of prevent vendor lock-in, so that if there's problems, you can switch to other equipment. So it's definitely one of the reasons to include this particular requirement.
Okay, thank you very much. There is a question from Yavat on the standards mapping matrix, but if I'm not mistaken, we have already answered this. But please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, you have already answered it.
Yes,
thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The same for the question from Ron. And there is a last question in the chat from Jose Antonio Gutierrez Diaz. In the supporting document, IEC 62443 set of standards is mentioned. Would they be the basis for harmonizing not only ICT products, but also for developing the entity security management systems?
Maybe Christian for the security management system part.
Yeah.
Do you want him to be?
As I already mentioned, we're trying to use international standards. So 62443 could be an international standard, but there are no standards that we've chosen so far, because this will be explicitly done by the working group afterwards. So we're gonna put different standards in the mapping metrics so that there will be shown that they, in which part they map. And we will develop our work on international standards, but there's nothing in place so far yet, so we can't say that explicitly the standard, for example, will be the basis for that in the future.
Yeah, maybe to add to that for the product part. So I think for the product, it depends also on European development. So as said, we are following the work that ENTSO is doing for European cybersecurity certification standards. So it depends on if these standards will adopt IEC 62443. Because at the moment it's considered, for instance, in the ICCS standard for industrial equipment that's being developed by JRC. So if that would, for instance, be become a European cybersecurity certification scheme, and it would use IEC 62443, then definitely IEC 62443 would be one of the options, or would be the basis for the requirements. But I think this is still under discussion. I think it's definitely one of the important candidates for product assurance, but it's not yet fully made out what it will look like in the future.
May I ask a question regarding this this product certification scheme? Will there be an impact analysis about product certification schemes and the impact on the electricity sector in Europe? Because in other industries, product certification schemes had quite interesting effects on sectors and on suppliers and on markets. And if this is not considered, I'm a little concerned.
I think, it will not be done explicitly in network code, but I think ENTSO is doing a much broader program about the cybersecurity certification scheme, and they're in a much better position to do this kind of impact assessments. And I've seen work at least going into this direction. So I think ENTSO-E EUDISO don't have the capability to do this fully, and also the plan is to use this European scheme, so that would be the main goal. I think one thing we do allow to sort of control the impact is always allow entities also to choose other options. So it's not planned to, or it's not included to make the use of certification schemes mandatory. If entities find that the certification schemes don't meet their needs, they are allowed to always do their own verification using the methods they choose.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at in the chat. There are no additional questions, and I'm wondering whether there are any other questions that you'd like to pose to the team.
Okay, one last question from me. I'm Javad again.
Sure. Yes.
So about the suppliers group, do you plan to put grouping on suppliers, like supplier, this is category A supplier, it's on solar business, one is wind business. So we have intake on that part. So we could have some recommendation, or standard mapping metrics would be certainly on that topic. So, or is it just like normally what the TSOs or TSOs would think? Because I think the supply chain is the most impacted body, because we are the one who would be forced to enforce these standards in our systems or develop them. So that's one point, like on the supply chain.
I think I said before, so the exact composition of, for instance, the working group still needs to be determined. I would imagine it's something similar to the drafting committee that's, for instance, now set up for network code, where you do see that the associations for specific sectors like Solar Power Europe or Wind Europe are considered as stakeholders. So that would be one way to organize it. But this is not fixed in the network code text, and something that will be determined during the implementation.
Okay.
Maybe just a general remark, because the question is also linked to similar questions that were raised before in a kind of way. The network code cannot really detail, I mean, we can detail everything in a network code, but then it will look like a contract. So we never reach agreement on a contract, I think, with so many parties. So that's why there is some, the network code fixes the frame, let's say, to implement the cybersecurity requirements we will, or whatever provisions, methodologies, how they will be developed, but it will not be written in a way, nominate, let's say, the stakeholders who are involved by name, except the ones like the institutions or ENTSO-E and ENTSO entity, which have different or higher responsibilities in developing the deliverables than others. And it also will not go, for example, into detail like the terms of references, of voting procedures, of agreements, of disagreements. This is something we will leave at a later stage, because this is some processes or names of stakeholders, etc., which may change in the future. So the network code, it's not a contract and it's not terms of references. So we need to keep some flexibility. So it's good that if you're interested in working on a particular topic, I think there is a lot of possibility how the code is already written, to raise your hand to be in the groups, or if you just are interested in a particular topic or participate to consultations, etc. Just to let you know, it's such a, we limit the details of a law as we do in also at national level, to have it flexible enough. Otherwise, it would be implementable in the end.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Any last questions or comments that you'd like to pose? Maybe in terms of the next steps from our side, after today's workshop, we are going to upload on the webpage the slides that you have seen today, and as well some key points out of today's discussion. The public consultation is open until the 10th of December, and we kindly invite you to provide your feedback. We will organize a second workshop on the 8th of December in order to provide any still open clarifications that you might need on the network code content. And with that workshop, we hope that we will try to close as many questions you might have in order also to facilitate your feedback to the public consultation. And then, as the timeline was shown previously, the goal is that on the 14th of January, we will submit the network code to Acer for their review and acceptance, and further to be forwarded to the European Commission. Meanwhile, if you have any questions or you would like to receive more information on the network code, we have provided through the public consultation an email address, contact person from ENTSO-E side, which is going to engage with the development team in order to provide the feedback you requested. So please feel free to address us on any way you find suitable, and we will try to provide the feedback needed. I see no other questions or raised hands. Maybe I can just give the floor back to Andrea and Christiane for final remarks. And yeah.
Yes, thank you very much from my side for the very interesting session, and many questions, and we took notes of everything, so absolutely will be taken care of. Thank you for attending. And Christian, please go ahead.
Yeah. I think there's not much to add. Thank you very much for all the constructive questions, and we really encourage you to contribute to the public consultation, because we are relying and we need your input to further improve the legal text. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank
Goodbye,
you as well
everyone.
for everyone participating, and I wish you a nice weekend. Goodbye.
Have
Goodbye.
a nice weekend.
Bye
Bye.
bye.
Bye
Nice
bye.
weekend.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.